So, yesterday evening, a ton of pretty unexpected info was released about a Star Wars game that's been mostly shrouded in mystery, and I can't imagine EA wanted this information to be made public, because none of it paints EA in a favorable light. In fact, it mostly just has the opposite effect. It makes them look incompetent. The game in question is Project Ragtag, a Star Wars game that we've talked about on the channel before. As far as plot goes, basically all we know is that the game was supposed to be about a group of criminals coming together to pull off a major heist. Anyway, before we jump into the very eye-opening new information about this game, I'll quickly summarize what we knew about Ragtag before this new interview, just to catch everyone up. If you already know everything we knew about Ragtag, as always, I'll have timestamps to the brand new information, but I really think this recap is pretty necessary because EA's meddling with this project is so ridiculous it would almost be funny if it weren't so pathetic. Project Ragtag was one of the very first Star Wars games commissioned by EA after they acquired the Star Wars gaming license in 2013. One of EA's major studios, Visceral Games, was given the project and cancelled another game they were well into developing to work on this new Star Wars game that was then codenamed Yuma and eventually became Project Ragtag. The game was to be a third-person action-adventure single-player game, and EA was going all in on the project, at least at first. I mean, they hired Amy Hennig to write the game's story, and if you don't know, Amy was the writer of the first 3 Uncharted games, which of course are incredible. I've actually never met a single person who doesn't like the Uncharted franchise who's played it. Anyway, after about a year of development, EA was having trouble with another one of their upcoming titles, Battlefield Hardline, so they took the entire Visceral Star Wars team off of that game and instead put them to work on Battlefield Hardline so they could get the game out that year. This is quite similar to what EA did with Battlefront 2 and Battlefield 5. When Battlefield 5 released, it was not really well received, so EA took most of the Battlefront 2 team and put them to work on Battlefield 5 to fix that game, and most of those devs never returned to Battlefront, which is why the Battlefront 2 team was tiny during most of the post-launch support. It's why I tried to be easy on the DICE devs and instead placed the blame on EA's shoulders when things went horribly wrong, because EA were giving DICE so few resources. If you can't tell, EA does not have a history of giving their Star Wars titles proper dev support. It's been clear over the years the Star Wars IP is put on the back burner whenever it's convenient. Anyway, once Battlefield Hardline was out, some of the team returned to Ragtag and work resumed on the project in one iteration or another for 5 more years, half a decade. I am very much simplifying the development of this game for the sake of getting to the new information, but during those 5 years this is what happened. Only half of the original development team was allowed to return to Project Ragtag in 2014, which obviously caused problems because EA wasn't allowing nearly enough developers to work on the project. Eventually, in mid-2015, Motive Studios was founded to help with the project, so the game was split between 2 separate studios in 2 separate countries, one in Canada and one in the US. Then, less than a year later, in early 2016, when the first EA Battlefront was extremely controversial at release, and EA wanted to get a sequel out as fast as humanly possible, they took the entire EA Motive team off of Ragtag and put them to work on Battlefront 2, leaving Ragtag with a tiny development team yet again. Also in 2016, EA laid off several Visceral Games employees, shrinking the game even further. Despite this, the team loved the project and wanted it to live on, and even with the small team they had, they managed to impress EA with the build of the game they had in 2016, a small part of which was shown at E3 that year. The Visceral team was then expanded to include some developers from another of EA studios, EA Vancouver, which again left them with the issue of the game being split between 2 studios in 2 different countries, again, one in Canada and Visceral Games in LA. Then in 2017, EA decided to shut down Visceral Games completely because they felt they were taking too long to get the game out, and this was also the cause of the infamous EA quote in 2017 where their CEO said no one wanted single-player games anymore, which is why they shut down Visceral Games. Then of course they released Fallen Order to huge numbers 2 years later, which is kind of hilarious. Anyway, EA then decided to shift all of the completed assets for Project Ragtag over to EA Vancouver, who they wanted to take the assets and rework them into a small game they could get out in 2017, this year. However, again 2 years later, EA felt they were taking too long and shut down the project for good at EA Vancouver last year in 2019. So, the game was in development for well over half a decade, just completely wasted development time filled with EA meddling, and all of what I just recapped we've known for a while. However, yesterday, two of the ex-developers from Visceral, one of whom worked on the game from the beginning, did a long-form podcast where they talked about their careers and also revealed a ton of information about Project Ragtag. I listened to the entire thing on the Min-Max show and compiled everything new, which is a lot. And let me start out this new information by saying it's downright depressing watching developers speak about games they worked on that were then cancelled. I mean, in this case, listening to the dev who worked on Ragtag, his name is Zach Mumbach, we have a guy who dedicated half a decade of his life to this project, only for it to be cancelled when much of the game was close to completion, at least from how he explains it. Keep in mind that much of the team that worked on Ragtag were the same team that made Dead Space 1 and 2, so we have a team led by the lead writer of the Uncharted series directing the developers who created Dead Space. Yet the way this dev describes things, EA just wouldn't give them the time or resources to finish the game they'd spent half a decade on. Zach, who again is the interviewed dev, starts out by saying how frustrating it was for the team to be moved to Battlefield Hardline after they'd started on Ragtag, because when that happened, many of their lead developers who were known for their work on single-player games left the studio entirely because they didn't want to work on a first-person shooter, and EA then replaced those devs with employees who were only experienced in first-person shooters. And once Hardline was out, EA expected the Ragtag team to function normally with several devs who had never worked on a single-player game before. He says more than anything else, that was the biggest mistake, and it seems to me that this is just another huge indication of the poor management that comes from the higher-ups at EA. They just don't seem to have any sort of game plan past the immediate future. Let's force our story team to work on an FPS, causing some of our best employees to leave our studio, so we then have to replace them with devs who can work on another game we need to rush out the door. And then once that's over, we'll expect those devs who didn't leave to somehow train these new devs with no single-player experience to work on a game that's nothing like what they're used to working on. Great game plan from EA as usual. However, he says despite all these roadblocks from higher up, they really had something special, and Amy had written a story he says was incredible. He also says that in his opinion, if they had been given the time they needed to achieve Amy's goals, they would have likely created the greatest Star Wars game ever made, and a contender for Game of the Year. Of course, that is a huge amount of pressure to put on a cancelled game, but I can't help but believe him considering who was leading the project. I mean, if you haven't played Uncharted, you wouldn't really know, but if you haven't, I guess just take my word for it. Those games are incredible, and if the same person who wrote the first 3 of those games was writing this game, I believe this game really could have been something special. However, the Visceral dev says EA came in and told Amy to cut this, cut that, basically cut everything that meant the game wouldn't come out when they wanted it to release. This has been yet another trend we've seen as plain as day. Battlefront 1 and 2 were rushed out the door. I mean, EA has publicly said the only reason Battlefront 2015 didn't have a campaign or content from other eras is because they wanted to push it out in time for the Force Awakens release. And with Battlefront 2, I mean, it kind of goes without saying that game was incredibly rushed. It took 2 solid years post-launch to get the game where it should have been at release. Anyway, Zach says that despite everything, the story and setup they had prepared for the game was incredible. It would just take them some time, and he even says that it seemed to him that EA saw how good the game they had laid out could be if they were just given enough time to pull it off. But EA was convinced single-player games were not worth the time or the effort Visceral wanted to put into the project, and EA was fully committed to their live service games, aka a game players would pay full price for, and then have to continue spending money on DLC and microtransactions if they wanted anything close to a full experience, which outside of a few exceptions, that system has already kind of imploded. Most people won't accept a full-price game that forces you to spend more money for things that aren't cosmetics or full-blown expansions that are well worth their price. Although again, of course, there are exceptions. Anyway, Zach then talks about the content of the game and how much was finished when Visceral was shut down, and from the sounds of it, things were really coming together despite all of their hardships. He says the team had many of the levels basically done or very close to being finished, and he specifically talks about an ATST set piece where you're being chased through a city that was completely finished. He then talks about the main character, who he says was incredibly well developed, and something that was really a shock to me is that Visceral had already completed the motion capture and voice acting for the game when it was cancelled. I mean, I just can't believe how much time and money was spent on this game when EA decided to shut it down because the studio felt single-player games just weren't worth the effort anymore. He also says that Amy had went out and specifically cast top-tier actors and actresses for every role, which I can't imagine was cheap, and I doubt we'll ever even know who those actors were. It's worth mentioning that the Visceral dev also says he never in his entire life worked on anything so far into development and so well received by everyone who played it that was then cancelled, which shouldn't come as a surprise, but still, it's just crazy to me that they'd waste that many resources only to shift the game's assets to another studio, tell them to condense it into something they could push out quickly, and then cancel that as well 2 more years after with more wasted development. I mean, they likely wasted $50 to $100 million, if not more. I mean, Visceral Games was located in LA, not exactly cheap for game development. Anyway, I just thought all of this was pretty interesting. It's such an interesting dynamic for me specifically, because obviously there's been games that have come out of EA's Star Wars deal I've enjoyed. Fallen Order, of course, and Battlefront 2, which is probably the multiplayer game I have the most hours in, partially because I made a ton of content on that game, but mostly because I enjoy it. At the same time, there is no denying just how many missteps there have been along the way, and this has only been further evidence of exactly that. The most depressing part about the interview is how he ends the conversation about Ragtag, because he says he hasn't even been able to bring himself to play Fallen Order because he's just been so down on Star Wars ever since they shut down Ragtag, and I can't exactly blame him. I mean, imagine dedicating the better half of a decade to something that was apparently so great, only for it to be then shut down and never see the light of day. I mean, you would feel like you'd thrown away years of your career and your life, which I would say would be enough to bum you out at least a little bit, but hey, that's just me. Well guys, that is going to do it for today's video. If you enjoyed it and could leave a like, I would definitely appreciate it, and if you are new around here, feel free to subscribe if you want. You don't have to, but it'd sure be a lot cooler if you did. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye. I'm